So let's talk about this. Really, the purpose of today is really to talk about how does a multinational make sense of identity across different countries. So as you look at, most of us today use Google or Facebook, and we understand that there is a limit to how much of our data we can really control. And even though one might say Facebook or Google might not be necessary to live life, some of these digital systems are becoming integrated parts of our society. So when we think about this, there's about 3.6 billion people around the world that will carry some form of national identification or identity card by 2021. And that's just around the corner. And with COVID-19, we'll be talking about how that's been accelerating quite rapidly. Some of the countries are using biometrics in some identity frameworks, like small countries like Nepal, all the way to large countries like Mexico. The Chinese government is certainly planning to build what I would call a little bit of a version of a Black Mirror that has daily analytics, and it uses these national identity infrastructures to sort of navigate this. So with several different countries, how does a multinational make sense of it? How does a multinational make sense that Nepal might be different than Mexico, that might be different than China, and they're operating along all these different identity verticals. And what I want to discuss today is whether a country or a specific set of rules and data sets might affect of how a company thinks about identity nationally. So when we talk about these different applicable data protection systems, this becomes super relevant in today's term when we're talking about surveillance. And one of the things I want you to really think about as I talk about identity through this presentation is really think of identity in the framework of permission. Don't think of identity as a static piece of documentation that you might be given, but it's something that actually in the context allows you to have and be identified. It could be something as simple as my Wi-Fi when my friend is over and they want to be able to have access, identity of my Wi-Fi. They're going to get something called a password to be able to connect. So as we think through this, how does Corona and what is the impact of COVID-19 in this infrastructure? Well, we all know this is a really hard time, but there's some great reflections and opportunities that technology is deriving in this time. As scientists around the world are working relentless hours to find a viable vaccine, then they're coordinating data sharing models. And all of this has become sort of an essential tool that is ongoing in the fight against COVID-19 and really the spread. It's the first time as a data scientist myself that I'm starting to see mass data collection be happening and share around interoperable standards. So naturally, when you think about this, any sweeping government sanction surveillance program, even though it might be well-intentioned, it raises some serious questions about how is our sensitive data being used? What is the data stewardship and care and who has access to it? How vulnerable is it? Are people understanding what leaks and hacks might happen? Could it be exploited to a private company in the future? And is there any way that I can mitigate all this? I think these are all really important questions that currently surface my mind as a technology strategist when we are in this tough, difficult transition time. But once we all know this pandemic is going to be over and we're going to be restored to what maybe will be normal, I don't think it will be really a version of normal. But the important part is, how do we keep close tabs and where does that data go? Where all did that health and data information has gone? What is the real-time geography distribution? We've seen some countries sanction and install, as an example, in Taiwan, they have a way when you enter the country, or every mobile provider has a way of tracking your geography, whether you like it or not. My question is, maybe that's okay for a pandemic-like scenario, but is that an okay thing post the fact? Do we bring back all of those questions about what multinationals have access to this? Who did you share it with? And I think that leads us to a conversation of, we've started to see data protection laws being banned and being changed. The interesting thing about it, to give you a little bit of background on data, is a lot of these data protection laws are either infant in its evolution, or they've been adjusted from usually the 90s to 2000s. And most of them, if you realize the internet was boomed, but things like Instagram or geolocation or even device ID weren't really advanced. We weren't collecting the type of rich data So with obviously COVID-19 happening, there is a lot of data protection laws that have started to see and feel the shift. So what does that mean? That means that at least 27 countries have already confirmed to have changed their data protection law in this time of a pandemic. They have looked at it and said, even the World Health Organization has declared that data stewardship and ethics need to be brought up to a human rights conversation. So when we think about this, some of the things kind of scare me because the EDPB, which is a data protection bias program, is confirmed that employers might be able to access health surveillance and information post the fact after the COVID-19 has passed without what we call consent, aka without you letting them have it, which is kind of a big problem if you think about. It brings an entire conversation into algorithms that you have no control over it and that you didn't even get asked to consent post the fact. So this is some of the gloom that has been bringing me to wonder, what is the difference between a conversation of public health versus sort of privacy? Where is your sensitive data being collected? And most people would say, of course, I'd rather be safe and have my data be out there. And I think that this is an opportunity for us to rethink globally really what this is all mean. If you think about it for a second and step away from the conversation, humans don't have a comprehensive framework for morals and values. Most of us would agree what a good person looks like, but there's a lot of gray in this conversation. So then what do we do with data? What do we do with this quantity of information that has drastically been increasing that we weren't ready for, that most of our frameworks didn't even think about? So my question of what would post-pandemic world look like, I think there is a lot to be revisited. And in terms of what is the framework of humans and what are we going to determine that is okay data that we keep, and what are we going to determine that is actually this is where the line ends and you have to show me value as a multinational or even a national organization to continue to have this thing that is very valuable that I hold, which is my identifiable data. So Matt, I know that some of the things that even in the States, the government has been openly working with, like Verily, which is a Google sister company, and is saying, hey, we're going to offer, as an example, screening tests. So the basic, what they're calling the basic COVID-19 tests. And you can see the data that a patient was actually infected, along with their nationality, their gender, their age, and the locations they visited. So they're compiling this. And under like sort of ordinary circumstances, sensitive patient-linked medical records can and should be kept private. So when I think about this, exposing them to a majority of other sources becomes a pretty big problem. Even when you look at the California Consumer Privacy Act, you would be, you today have what we call PET, privacy enhancing technologies, that have an opportunity to share the relevant data for the sake of control and the sake of understanding and the beauty that aggregated data brings as insights, but it still keeps people private. So when people ask me, what is this balance between convenience and security, I often say, leave the balance for yoga and the circus and behind. Like, it's not it's an excuse. Today we have technology, and you can have technology partners that can do both ensure your data is kept by law and private, as well as still be convenient as a user experience. But these are some of the thoughts that really come to me as a data scientist looking at this identity privacy landscape on a post-COVID scenario.
Yeah, there's a lot to digest and think here, and it's happening real time and fast, right? There's just a lot. I think it's really becoming a lot of awareness from consumers right now. Just in general, it's in the media. There's questions being asked, raised. I think about the Google-Apple partnership, for example, that they're working on a tracing app and using low Bluetooth energy. And you can see they're really focusing on why it's going to be private and that it's not going to be kept, and talking about decommissioning strategies. But consumers are rightfully skeptical that that's the case. And, you know, there's there's a number of them, and then even in the media, people asking questions around, is this just going to be more data that's collected? Is it going to go away? How do we really know it's gone away? What's your take on, where this is, likely going? Is this maybe a catalyst that's going to shift more power to consumers and shining light on the situation, or is it, are we sort of resigned to companies are going to be collecting information and we don't really know if it is going to be, turned off at some point or used in some other manner? It seems like we're at an inflection point here.
Totally, Matt. I think the inflection point is long overdue, in my opinion, and it's sad to see it being a catalyst. I've seen some jokes about who's like your best innovation catalyst, and most people are saying it's COVID-19 versus my CTO or my head of innovation. It's sad to think that humanity needed something this drastic to maybe change behavior. But one of the other things that we can learn from China, in my opinion, as sort of looking at technology trends and facts, is power will shift. You asked that question, will power shift to consumers? I think longer are the days that you don't realize, and soon are your days as a business if you don't realize that power is in the hands of consumers. And the reason why I use the word China is because China has seen the most amount of unicorns be raised, like companies, for those who don't know what that means, companies that go from zero to like really big valuations, massive user bases, to be destroyed within seconds as a trend. So that just shows how really the power is in the consumer when you have things like a universal identity system that's interoperable, which most WeChat, Tencent, and some of these other countries, these other companies in China share. It allows the migration. So when you have standards, when people ask me, why do you care about identity and standards? I say, when you have standards, you have an opportunity for the consumer to migrate. You've literally freed them from the technology burden of stickiness, which we used to call. And I think if you look at the younger generations, the tolerance or what's new or the coolest is changing ever fast. And if you have, like me, an 8 or 12-year-old at home, there's a lot of TikTok dancing going around. And like that is a company that has seen the most amount of downloads in the past year out of all of these other ones. As much as I do worry about Google, and so to touch on your other point, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, and any of these partnerships that might arise, I think there is a deeper understanding, which I will go into, about what is data, right? The consumer, I think there's this myth and this fear that's being created. I think that is it's a pandemic size fear versus a breach size fear. When you saw in the U.S., at least in the past few years, the number of breaches and data breaches, I think the average person knows that as a vocabulary now and probably didn't a few years ago. I think now there is a concern about where is my health data going, but do I have the tools as a citizen or as a society to really put data ownership into practice? Do I have a value, a tangible financial value attached to this asset? Is it effectively interoperable? Because if you take a second, faster than anything society is building, we're building data. It's the largest asset class in the planet. So,
and I think consumers are certainly aware of this. They're paying attention. You see companies that are starting to even bring some of these privacy and data stewardship messages, into view and going to market with them, and with consumers having.
They're silly if they didn't. Like, I think a lot of companies have had that in the back burner. Some companies have had that as a pillar, but didn't really take it seriously or didn't really understand how to bring that message to consumers. One of the things I would say to your organization, for you who is listening out there, is how are you using that messaging moving forward? How are you empowering and bringing literacy to your consumer of what does it mean and why they should care and why they do business with you? Because effectively, if you believe what I believe, that the power is in their hands to choose who they do business with. You want to use that to articulate and say, actually, I'm giving you contextual value based on your data. I'm not taking your basic identification or data to just sell it off to some marketing, which is what most people are afraid of.
Sure, so most people think it's happening. They see what they're agreeing to and they assume the worst.
Exactly, right? And it's rightfully or wrongfully is the world has a duopoly on ads when you think about it between Facebook and Google, and they do sell on your like your data of wanting to buy this thing, and there's cost per click, so there is a perception there. But I think where the future will be is understanding that you can have the data. The data is the same thing as an asset. Like having a lot of money is great, but it's also a liability because you might be robbed, you might be a target, you might have fluctuating assets in the stock exchange. The same way people have to think about data is an asset if you know how to use it. Are your systems smart enough to understand how to use that data in a contextual manner? Or are you offering me tickets to, I don't know, Formula One, and maybe I hate Formula One? Like what are you providing of contextual value in that you gather the data, great. Now what do you do? And I think that pandemic has us raising questions about the people that are gathering the data for a social, economical health impact good. But it's like, when does it become your economical gain on this moving forward? And when does those surveillance have to be a human rights conversation like we talked about extensively? And I gave examples of the different countries on our first webinar.
Yeah, exactly. So I know we've got a lot to get in here on the stewardship and what's happening. So let's get into some of that, and we'll revisit some of this conversation as we go forward here. It's truly fascinating.
Perfect. So how is the world keeping up with privacy? So as we think about this, I want us to really look at how to operate when different countries have different privacy rules. Really, how do you think about experience and having sight of regulatory frameworks? So a lot of my clients have asked me this, and they'll say, Bianca, I have global clients. I want to be able to offer them the same experience because we compare people to their latest experience. You compared me to the last time you watched the webinar. So it's similar in that way, right? So how do you know that you've moved, your technology stack has moved to be able to have a global infrastructure, but to your client, the experience is the same and it's seamless? And when we think about this, one of the first things that come to mind is, do you understand the regulatory framework in these different countries? Have you really thought long and hard to understand where does your technology residing, and how are you offering what I called before, that contextual information? Are you understanding, hey, now Bianca really needs this information. She's on her phone, but she's actually crossed the borders from Germany to another country, right? So, and now that other country has completely different privacy laws. And so when we look at some of the things like, there's about 30% of United Nations that have declared that they don't have data protection laws. So what does this mean when you're operating a multinational organization? To me, if I were to give you a piece of advice for whatever it's worth, is operate by the most obviously stringent data privacy regulatory framework, but make sure it makes sense for your business. And what I'm going to mean by that is that it's not only paying attention to what your consumers are worried about. What are your consumers taking a look at? What are they thinking about? And when I look at the world from a global view, you would look at this and say, hey, Bianca, pretty much Africa's kind of screwed. The United States is okay. I'll give you a kicker. There is different states, and different states have different, now the DMV is working on different identity and different driver's license. If you are providing a service to not even going multinational, but just offering to multiple states in the U.S., you might be governed by different privacy laws. Most organizations go, oh my God, then I don't want to touch any data. Is that the solution? No, the solution is looking at your vendors and who in your technology stack or your group of advisors, consultants, has a deep understanding of how your business processes are navigating the law of each state or the law of each country. And how does that make it not a massive compliance burden? And then my question is to some people that are smaller is that really your core competency? Is that something you should be thinking about? Is that something you need to be understanding? My answer is probably no. Your business and your value add is somewhere else other than in this conversation. So one of the things that I often think about when I think about going global and looking at data and looking at identity is diversity. It's a massive problem, and I'll explain to you in a basic parameter as a mathematician and a data science person. If you think about how an average is built, as data scientists, we're kind of brainy. So we have a way of, let's say, calling and finding what's called efficiency. And efficiency is what is the level of accuracy of your data model. Is it 100% accurate all the time? And why is that a problem for diversity? Well, most diverse groups are underrepresented in numbers. They might be minorities, they might be not included in your data sets. So that means that you have a lot of data sets about the people in the middle, and then you have little data sets about the other people that are less representative. How does that become a problem? If you're not aware of this, your algorithms and your data sets become biased. They have a natural bias from the moment that they were developed based on what is your team and how diverse is your team building that data set and how understanding and caring, which Matt called data stewardship, are they of that set of data. And then the other portion is that they don't realize that maybe they don't have access, or maybe their boss, which often happens in business where data and privacy become a little bit compromised, is they want to say, hey, our product needs to be 100% accurate. Or I need to know from a commercial purpose, my net promoter score. This is probably my favorite example. And in your net promoter score, you will go in and say, an 8 is an 8, and that's a point. And then a 7 is everything below is not relevant because you don't get bonus space out of it, or is not important, or our firm will never drop below that. What happens to this is you're effectively telling it that a 7 is nothing compared to an 8. It's actually not that similar, not that different. There is a nuance there that is based on your business logic or in your operating controls, but from a pure technology perspective, if you make that binary decision and static decision, you lose the most beautiful thing of data, which is diversity, is the little nuances that allow you to have this. And this goes into how often you update those sets. Do you have a deep understanding of them, which is why it's so important to have the right set of partners in your technology stack and your business acumen moving forward. And make sure that your promotion bonus on the Net Promoter Score doesn't compromise how you're going to train and build these data sets. So when I think about this, obviously as multi-factor authentication options are deepening, there's a higher level of security required to access this data. So you're saying this data is super complex. What most people have forgotten is that they build a binary thing. If you look at the financial services industry as an example, and I'm coming in from a data science expertise, is they will do and say, if you have over $50,000 to transfer, you have to do a multi-factor authentication. So you might get one of those token things that RSA produces. You might have an SMS sent to your phone. You might have an array of different MFA options. What that does is it says that every time you do 50,000 is this binary, yes, now I need to step it up. What we talked about from a COVID-19 perspective, or even a generational futuristic understanding of customer relationship with value, is power shifting. So if you don't learn that every time I do 50,000 is not the same, that there is a nuance on this time I do 50,000 is every time I do payroll. Why are you asking me? I'm always home in the same Wi-Fi, in the same device ID. So I have all these data sets to tell me a pretty story. And that's what people often forget when it comes to looking at how standards can be so effectively, because standards allow you to put all these data sets in the same boxes and say they all belong in this. And every time I bake cakes, I use these instruments or these ingredients. You can totally tell how great a cook or baker I am. So how do you look at data? How do you rethink UX and UI interfaces? How do you look at this and think about it in a dynamic, interesting form? One of the things that people often ask me is, how do I store all this data? A lot of you don't want to be kept with these legacy infrastructures and systems. Well, the first exercise your organization needs to do is understand where in that consumer journey you need to store data. what data you need to have. Do you need to be the guy that has access to the bureaus, access to their bank account? You need to be the one doing their government check verification? Or can you just trust different providers, just kind of like you would have a extension cord where you would only plug the things that you're needing and you would unplug them as you need space for the others. That's how I want you to look at data, and that's how I want you to think of data. Because one of the biggest things that data has as an asset class is a foundation. And how do you turn that into a strategy? You have to stop building processes and bureaucratic paperwork around it, which, remember the conversation, if you have a lot of data privacy regulation laws and different countries you're operating in, the storing of this big valuable thing, like people say data is the new oil, it's not. If it's not identifiable and it's not contextual, it's irrelevant. Knowing that I dated somebody in high school, good for you. It's kind of old news. It's about what I need now. So one of the things that we've been starting to see is how that user behavior is changing so quickly and how we are behaving in so many different platforms. So as a curious question, and maybe you can leave that to me later or you can comment, how many of you here have LinkedIn? I would assume most. How many of you here have either WhatsApp, Facebook, or Instagram? All right, awesome, some reactions. Who here has the exact same photo on both? Probably not a lot. So what I want to tell you is maybe you're not all trustworthy, but I think it's further than that. It shows you how data is contextual. It shows you how identity has multi-factors and multi-attributes. In other words, lots of little points of the story. In your LinkedIn, you might want to look professional, sharp. You might want to demand that you think I'm an expert. On my WhatsApp, I might be willing to be a little bit more casual and a little bit more fun and show another side of my personality. That doesn't mean I have a multitude of ways, but that means that now organizations are having to deal with this consumer behavior that I'm going to show parts of, I'm going to authorize parts of who I am based on that contextual information around me. So one of the things that...
Yeah, Bianca, I think about another good example of this. When I was growing up, my parents would always be surprised when they'd go to school and they'd hear this great report. I was a model student compared to how I would act up at home. Two different identities there, personalities, and, context. It's everything, right? Everyone does have different identities and contexts, and depending on the channel and what the purpose of that type of platform might be, it varies differently. And without the context...
Is your photo the same, Matt?
What's that?
Is your photo the same on both channels?
My photos are not the same. They're not the same.
See? Point proven. At least one.
And they're all actually locked down as much as they can be on the ones where I wanted to be friends and family primarily. But it's certainly something that's respectable.
So when you think about this, I think one of the biggest lessons here is how is your discipline around understanding that data? How is your discipline around understanding when you need to store it? How do you need to store it? What legislation applies to it? And then who are your providers and how well equipped are they to really help you make that decision? And how are your business processes and sort of your bureaucratic background aligned so this works like a nice, even machine? That's what we see, the power of standards, interoperability, and trusting global partners that have a reputable standards when it comes to ethics. They're quite open about how and where they store their data, what they do with it, what is the length of time, how do they keep it private. I think those are the things that today we need to look for more than ever.
Right, and I think you brought up a good point on the data and just sort of data itself, raw data, it's important, but some of it, you have it, so what? It's the contextual, it's being able to understand, make sense of it, turn it into something actionable, but importantly, making sure you're complying with all those regulations, whether they're industry, whether they're regional, and really having something in place to manage that, really, because if that's not your core business, it's incredibly complex, it's moving, it's evolving, and the consequences are really dire.
Right? Like we just talked about how 27 countries in less than a 3-month span have changed their entire legislative system. Do you think that your system is equipped, or software legacy systems are even equipped to change at a pace that has not even made it to any standard or interoperable bodies.
That's exactly right. I mean, that is, there's businesses just for that, and rightfully so. It's moving so quickly, and everywhere you do business, you could have a liability and be exposed if you're not on top of that.
Totally, and it's a scary thought. All right, so let's talk about some of the big words that when it comes to people asking me about privacy and data strategies, machine learning always comes to mind, and I wanted to sort of give you a crash course on it. So one of the basics of sort of this overview and how I want you to think about it is, how do we install machines to understand a pattern? So humans think that they're all special and we have lots of characteristics, but we're creatures of habit, and a machine can pick up habits and patterns at a much more fast pace than anything else. So when you look at where machine learning came from, obviously artificial intelligence enables sort of these machines to create efficiency that was previously sort of totally unachievable at the speed and the which they compute, and I won't even get into quantum computing. So when you're thinking about it, one of the things that it becomes a massive change is that you're only as good as your data. So if you kind of pour garbage into that machine's going to pour garbage right back out at you. And it's not going to be any smarter. It's not going to be any faster. And it might actually change the way you make decisions. And I think one of the disciplines and the things we're starting to see with data science and machine learning is that it's going from analysis. So it's going from compiling a massive amount of data, like think about historical data from your clients or from their transactions, and then giving you a nice graph and predictions, to actually making decisions, which becomes a little bit of a scary conversation in which you need to understand how robust is your library. Is it diverse, like I talked before? And one of the things I often tell clients to think about is the 3 V's of data. So your volume, in which volume are you receiving that data? Are you ready? In which variety? So is it super diverse, and are you ready to understand and interpret all these data sets and understand the minorities or the diversity within the data that is actually giving you a cultural understanding? One of my clients was not understanding why this one product wasn't marketing well, and there was a small nuance in terms of just time and culture and religion of the buyer that they didn't take into consideration. So something as simple as a religious holiday might affect a specific target group. That might be a small target group, but that might make a massive difference on how your machine learns if it doesn't acknowledge it. So it's like those bad cartoons you've seen of machines recognizing, I don't know, a truck like a cat, right? And that's really the scary part of this. And as we teach computers how to learn from us, as we look at this, some of the information that I talked to you about is what can you not do? And talking about global privacy, there's things like privacy by design, which is an established body of looking and saying, is my robot private? Are my artificial intelligence models understanding that privacy is important? One interesting thing that I love about data sciences as a discipline is it's a culture of experimentation. And if you know anything about experimentation, it's going to go wrong. There's going to be things that are not going to hit right. And how are you allowing your business processes and your data models to learn? It's making a safe environment for them to learn, but they're not learning so much that they might be causing something really bad and severe for an end result, like denying a loan. And we've started to see some of these things happen in the landscape, and it's directly linked to identity, because if you remember, one of my first things is identity is permission. And if I don't have the right attribute, and some of the people talked about, how do you put a value signal? Is this good or bad? Is this ethical or unethical? Is this private or not private? How do you add a little piece to that puzzle and say, hey, these two things actually in this context are private? I'm not willing to share. It's like you've gone too far in a personal relationship. Ask a weird question. That's kind of where the line is. It's contextually, and it's happening super fast. So when people say to me, well, I need an AI tool, I say, wait a second. You need a data strategy first, and a privacy strategy first, and a diversity strategy, not only because it's the right thing to do for your business longevity, but it's also for the decisions that that value might be bringing. If you're relying on technology, there's consequences of relying on technology heavily without thinking it about ahead of time.
Bianca, do you find a lot of organizations are focused more on tools, or we need this solution, or I heard this, we better implement, this without thinking about the broader, context of that?
Totally. And that's exactly where I was going to next. Like, there is a lot of risk of people getting into directly thinking. I've heard, and I hear this a lot, Matt, because I'm a biometric expert. As a CIO of a previous biometric company, people used to say to me, like, I need this solution. I saw it on TV, or it's going to make my competitive, without really thinking. So they start stitching together what I would call a Frankenstein. And that's a very, very scary situation to be in.
Yeah, I mean, we're very familiar with that as well, with individual points, tying things together. I mean, you don't know how they're going to work together. In a lot of cases, they won't. You can create not only privacy problems, but latency issues. There's just more points of breakage, too, when you do that.
Correct. And that's often why I tell people, like, to look and think about your interoperability and integration. Not like you used to think about old integration jobs. That is like, I picked a new technology stack. Now I have to be in this integration project for 3 years. Long are the days that you can have the luxury, let's call it, to take that long. But I think it's understanding the power of something like, technologically speaking, a microservices technology, something that is an array of small things that are interoperable. Think about it as Lego. It's the best example as a human being I can probably think about. And then that allows you to really operate it globally, because then you can say this little portion actually needs to be global versus my entire infrastructure. So when I think about this, one of the things is that the degree of harmonization is far, 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 shame on all of us in this industry, from where it needs to be. And the impact of this is really looking at a cross-sector collaboration between different industries, from mobile operators to finance to government. And that's historically where politics gets the best of technology. Even though technology is actually technically capable, there's all the politics and the human complexity systems and societal systems that get in the way of us agreeing that green is green, black is black, and this is how we're going to trade our Lego pieces. And if you think about it ethically and privately, that becomes an even more far beyond my domain of expertise. But if Plato and some of the greater philosophers couldn't solve it, how are we going to solve a framework for ethics and sort of privacy if we can't even agree? And I think a lot of this becomes a cultural conversation as well, that I often find fascinating, which is, I think we're starting to see it with COVID more than ever, is my notion of what is private to me might be vastly different than you. I might be in Denmark with an ethics with one of the oldest monarchies in the world and believe in freedom of speech and have all these things, and I might be in China and have a completely different set of values and cultural understanding. And people often confuse these things and try to label them as, okay, one is right, the other one is wrong. There's a lot of degrees here to really understand and peel this onion. So when I think about this, it's really an opportunity to manage data, because if these microservices are contextual, they're storing the data based on when they're being used. It's like storing the right information when you really need it and bringing it out at the right time instead of asking that sort of inconvenient, weird question. So a greater recognition of this, it needs to happen, right? We often see industry-wise our regulators practice a catch-up game most of the time. We started to see some sort of forward thinking with GDPR, and even California and the States and in Brazil and other countries that have looked at this post-pandemic world and said, we need solutions and we need solutions fast. But one of my biggest criticisms to the compliance department, thinking about the KYC and AML functions particularly, is that they often operate in a world of regulatory, because they have to. And it's a law discipline versus being a risk discipline. And a law discipline is what is written in the law shall be black versus white. And sure, there's an interpretation, but a risk discipline is changing with your consumers. So it's taking advantage of the fundamentals of data and the ability of the speed. Remember my 3 V's again: variety, velocity, volume. of data. It's really bringing those three things into consideration, so it's moving at the right speed for business. So, and the basics around why are simple, is because criminals don't do POCs. Criminals don't do procurements. They don't do RFPs and RFIs. They kind of find the fastest, easiest way to socially engineer their ways into breaches and finding these data points because they're there at the right time. It's almost like they're, in an analogy of a day, they're the right day at the right time, and they just lightning struck because they understood the context of your data and they observed it for a right period of time, versus that clueless guy that kind of just took it for granted and then shows up and says, hey, and you're like, the date was 3 weeks ago, like, or the date wasn't with me, or we're in the wrong restaurant, or something that sounds silly example, but it happens every day in the world of offering, and it happens every day to your organization. So when you look at this, breaches happen in all fields. When people ask me to talk about global privacy and data strategies, people talk to me about, but what about the fines? Give me the dirt. Well, let me give you the dirt. And the dirt is around some big corporations. So let's talk about some breaches. This is some of the 6 biggest GDPR fines that we have seen in the last year that has been in effect. British Airways suffered about an ouchie $204 million. But one of the ones that I want to bring your attention to is actually surrounding Google. And Google talks about that the fine didn't involve a data breach like Marriott or British Airways cases. So it wasn't around just the identity and the basic password information. But it was actually fined by the French regulator because it wasn't easily accessible, and actually it was found guilty for actually not seeking consent. So it made it super complicated. Some of you might be able to relate to this when you think about opening a new browser today and seeing how many cookies pop up and how many things are all over your face and saying, hey, do you accept this, do you accept that? If you really want the site, most of us just click yes. Maybe we read if there's an option. Some European ones are better. But most of us just click yes. And if you really look at it, there's even pranks that have happened with Apple writing that they own your firstborn child on terms and conditions on April Fool's and seeing how many people signed. And the numbers are staggering and scary. But what I want to drive you to is that I think this industry needs to urge the conversation of what consent really means. We need to make it simple for people to understand what they're accepting to. So you as a business need to be really clear on what value you're bringing to your client. If you really want to be private and you want to respect that you're really providing, hey, here's the rules of the game. We're going to play this. And if we agree with the rules, then we know what we're playing and we can't really complain. And I think that kind of honesty is one of my first policies. And I think these are some of the things that we can really learn from all of this, is that if you're multinational, what are the values of your organization? And maybe you operate in cultural, contextual, different values, but the really, really important part of this is understanding how are you living through your values through things like technology. And it sounds a little bit backwards coming from a technologist myself, but it's understanding how you are in that journey and understanding what Matt brought up earlier about that power shift changing. Consumers are going to know it eventually. And it's kind of like, do you want them to find out, just like we saw in the financial crisis, how much banks charge and then go, screw you, that's not valuable? Or do you want to be upfront with it and say, here's how I charge, and I'm using a basic example of charging, but it can be an array of different things. Here's the vendors I use to make sure you're safe. I think a lot of people downplay this. Like you might be, and this is one of the lessons I think from the East to the West that we can really learn, and some of the more, frankly, the Asian countries that are advancing in technology quite rapidly, we have a misconception, I think, internationally about how, well, they don't have rights over there. And I won't get into this because otherwise there's a whole webinar on privacy and data strategy on the East and what can we learn to go to the West. And I think that some of these are cultural debates and philosophical debates that are far beyond my understanding. But I think the deepening that goes with it is to understand that your client is going to know. And the truth is going to come out, and you really want to be able to provide value. And some of these vendors, actually, some of these companies provide value by saying, I'm not really good at all the nuts and bolts, just like you see a Formula One car again. They might build the engine, but somebody else builds the wheels, and somebody else builds something else, and there's a guy that drives it. It's a teamwork, and they actually are pretty proud to flaunt this. somehow in this world of tech is the new imperative, we've all hidden as multinational organizations of actually giving the praise where the praise is due and saying, my vendors that do this are this. As Matt and I agreed earlier, some of these small things like a legislation or a biometric identification system or a credit bureau that you have access to, they're an entire day job for an entire company. And if you think that you can do it alone, you're wrong. And I think that that's some of the things that we can really learn when we think of the world of microservices and when you think about data as a strategy and you say, I want to be cool and I want to be doing machine learning. That's what I want you to know. It's knowing and understanding your limits within that infrastructure and really applying this to the right society and to sort of align with your company values deep below. And I think one of the things I'd recommend you checking it out is really privacy by design and really thinking about what is the definition of data privacy. And I think what is the definition and how do you manage your 3 V's of data and your velocity and your variety to make sure you're diverse, inclusive, and rocking on this business. So I think that that's sort of a little bit of an overview, Matt, on this massive topic. And I thank TransUnion, and I hope you guys have fun.
Yeah, it is a massive topic, and you've dived into a lot, and I think certainly raised hopefully some really good points and some good takeaways, and probably also raised a lot of questions for everyone today.
But we have to define together. We have to keep talking as an industry, I think. I think that's the purpose of things like this. And I think that the more we bring on the tough questions, like let's debate it and talk.
Yeah, and this isn't something that's static, right? You go and you have this problem, you solve it, and then you're on to the next crisis or fire drill. This is an ongoing, evolving, and continuously becoming more and more complex area that really is something that you've got to have a strategy around, I think. Like this is, you solve the problem and move on. Much like when COVID-19 passes, we'll solve the main pain point, but it's still going to be downstream effects for that for quite some time. I think really getting a strategy around, what your
and I think it's a chance to reevaluate, right? Like I think it's like I'm looking at this post-COVID-19 world or during COVID-19 as a chance to really reconnect and reevaluate. And we hear a lot of that in your personal feed perhaps, but maybe some of us don't apply that for the business. But I think that that's a perfect time and opportunity for you to revisit those dreadfully boring things like privacy and data that you might have not looked at for months to come. So when people tell me or ask me, Bianca, as an expert, is the identity privacy data landscape dying because of the pandemic? I would say to you, it's thriving. And actually the people that are not paying attention during this time, I think will really suffer from it on the long run, not only from a fine or breach perspective as these privacy laws get updated, but actually from a value and client consumer centric perspective.
Yeah, and what we talked about on the first webinar for those that attended, and if you didn't attend, was this shift in digital and the transactions and things moving online. And it's imperative that you know who you're transacting with, not just to comply with regulations, but for your business or strategy, delivering friction right experiences for consumers. All those things are happening and accelerating in pace right now. And those that are positioned to capitalize on it are going to do well, and those that are just looking at this, as you said, in a privacy or data or compliance standpoint, really aren't thinking about it the right way. This is the way that things were going this direction, and things were moving online. It's accelerating, and it's going to be competitive. And those that have a strategy in place and are able to scale it and execute it, they're likely to do very well.
Yeah, and I think I think you nailed it by saying, like, it's not I'm done, I put the Band-Aid on it and I'm done and I'm not having to revisit. I think I joke with people and say that we're really good, we're really smart. Data scientists are brilliant. We found a way to make sure you're stuck with us and we're still relevant. So this thing is evolving. It's not you bought it once, put it there and called it pretty.
Yeah, that's right. I can tell you that they are brilliant, and we have a lot of them here at TransUnion, being an information company, but our core and foundation is really on analytics too, and the applying analytics and technology to the data to turn into actionable insights. And they're really looking on the front lines and creating solutions that are able to help customers make sense of it and to comply and solve problems in their businesses. So they're really powerful people. So I do want to take a moment here and just say, if you do have questions, enter them in the box below. We've got a few minutes here to take some. So I want to make sure we give opportunity to answer some Q&A here. Again, if we don't get to your question, we do get them all recorded here, and promise we're not going to do anything other than reach out to you directly to give you an answer and have a conversation if necessary to help you make sure you have a satisfactory answer to them. So go ahead and enter them in the box. And as we're waiting for a few of those to come in, Bianca, I think one of my sort of first questions is, yeah, we've talked about this need to have a strategy and to really think about how you're going to sort of address this. But there's been a lot of talk, and you brought up how you shouldn't go it alone and build your own solutions or sort of do things patchwork. Why do you think a lot of organizations are still sort of in that thought process or realm of either build it or just put a Band-Aid on a problem and continue to go down that approach versus taking a step back and saying, how do we solve for this holistically?
Great question, Matt. I think there's, I'll tell you the ones that I think are building it themselves. I think there's a lot of organizations that have historically not understood their value for clients. And I will point financial services as one of the key of them. They kind of build and grew as building products, and then their products became commoditized like any other most things. And they started thinking that in order for them to have further value, that they needed to build cooler underground things that nobody sees. So they decided to build under the hood and kind of forgot to be relevant and take their head out of the hood. And I think that's how you're starting to see a surge of obviously fintechs and other smaller technology companies displacing financial services at its core. So I think it's this sort of blinding that came in from having to have a technology strategy and thinking that having a strategy means doing it yourself. And I think that that's a misconception in the marketplace. Addressing your second point or second sort of alternative, the people that sort of put a Band-Aid to it and say, well, I'm compliant, or I've done AML5 as an example. They don't understand. There's a lack of literacy. And I would say that for you to be a business owner this year moving forward, you have to go get yourself educated on what data is, listen to things like this, and really understanding or reaching out to your partner, which might be, as you said, you have a vast amount. TransUnion is one of many that has a vast amount of brilliant people working. So maybe you can go get an education by having a relationship with your technology vendor, which I think a lot of people see it as my relationship with my technology vendor is I'm buying a set of APIs or SDK, or I'm buying a SaaS product, versus you are a source of knowledge and this is all you do. Can you come educate me for the value so I can think about a strategy? I think those are the partnerships in the future that will prevail and bring value to the end consumer. And those will be the businesses that will really succeed.
Right, and we have an untold number of very talented, smart, intelligent folks. So this is what they do all day long. And we're continuing to grow the amount of people that are devoted to that because it is that complex and you need to have that knowledge. And we really don't like to think of it as technology. Yes, you have to have technology and we deliver solutions, but it's really looking at the trends, analyzing what's happening, staying a step ahead of what's taking place, and really consulting and being a partner to really take some of this burden away rather than just give you a solution to implement and hope that it works out. So that's
and
really
I think that's what most people have to change, Matt. Like, I think you as a business owner, as a multinational corporation, what are you demanding for that SaaS operating budget that is always there in your line, right? Like, what are you getting for that value? I think table stakes is what you said. You deliver some technology, great, because this is in charity. There's an exchange, but there's so much more value that can actually bring you, which is why most organizations only use 60% of each software vendor's capacity, because they don't even take the time to really understand what the software is able to do for their business. So then they just implement it, plug it in there, and then leave it over there in the extension cord with the hopes that maybe someday it will turn a light on. And you're like, oh, that's nice. Didn't know that did that.
Yeah, and another point of that, if you put something out there and let it be, at some point there might be some sort of vulnerability or there might be new tactics. One thing you touched on was how a lot of organizations, they take their time, they do RFPs, they have a lot of process, they move slow. Fraudsters don't operate on those timelines. They operate real time, they collaborate, they have perfect information, and they coordinate and talk to each other and say, here's who you attack them until they figure it out and shut it down, right? So you've really got to be nimble and looking for what's ahead, and be that organization that is not their first choice, right? They're going to take the path of least resistance in most cases.
Of course, and they're going to use every technology
you don't want to be that least
in
resistance.
their hands. I think that's the other thing I often tell people. It's like one of my favorite things as a previous CIO, and I sit on boards of some technology companies, is when senior executives come to me and say, how many places have you implemented this innovation just like me that I can have reference to? And there's an oxymoron there of innovating, and there is a fear-based structure that has been built, unfortunately, in a lot of large corporations, whereas I don't want to be the guy that got fired because we experimented something and it changed. And what they missed is exactly what you said, that criminals are just going to change. And it's interesting when you look at the data of the innovation error of you implementing something and finding a vulnerability is much lesser than any fraud amounts that organizations have suffered. Because exactly what you said, cybers just don't care. They'll use the least path of resistance, and they'll use every technology tool that gets handed to them, because why not? If I can get it from here to here faster, I will. My chances of getting caught have reduced. My value has increased. And I think that's the difference in that chase to consumers or to bringing value.
Yeah, and they're getting statistically, really good at being able to, if they do get caught, the penalties, and you get in the room with a jury, and the damage that might cause to an organization, it's the risk reward is way out of balance.
Yeah, it's ginormous, and that's what people don't understand, and that's what I'm saying to you. They manage based on fear. There's empowerment structures that are wrong historically, like KPIs are usually structured wrong. You Walmart guy that will play safe and will pick a vendor that has been a vendor for 13,000 years because they're like, I ain't getting fired for that. There is precedent, even though you were fighting a very different looking game. You were fighting a game where organizations are moving at the speed of light, where you have to look at a global landscape to survive. And I think a lot of the post-COVID world has taught us that. A lot of the organizations I think will survive have diversification, and not only on their client base, but on their data sets, because they were able to adapt easier.
Yeah, right. Those that were ready and were going down this path already are well positioned, and those that weren't are finding themselves scrambling. And certainly, if you're going through this process right now, if you're one of those that's sort of scrambling, you've got to figure it out now. But think about how do we avoid that going forward. And a question I've seen come up here as we get close to the end of our allotted time is, I know I need to do something. I've got some problems here. I may be one of those people that have multiple things, or homegrown, or we're not approaching it the way you've talked about. How do they get started? What's a really good sort of first point of action to get some momentum going to getting going in the right direction?
Great question. I think that one of the first things they have to do internally is redefine what identity and data really is for them as a strategy. And what is it? I think I've been into many meetings where particularly banks or actually large telecommunication companies will have multiple owners of identity. So if you bring all the executives into a room, there'll be like 7. So they each own their own kingdom. And usually with that, there's even preferences and biases, as I talked about, of their own choices. And they maybe have married the organization to a channel specific, to a product specific strategy. So I think it's good old letting go, some group therapy to redefine identity and data, and then some understanding of who are your long-term sort of trusted partners on the things you identify are important. Is it important to know you operate in multiple jurisdictions? Okay, so I need somebody who understands these jurisdictions. What is the value of what I provide, and what do I need in the future to keep providing that value? What kind of data will I have to have the contextual relevance to my customer in the future? And then mapping out from there, who are the people that can help me do this? Because what you're really good at is providing the best yoga app in the world. you're not really good at knowing where I am in the world, even though you're a global yoga app, or how my food has changed, or what is my document verification if you have, if in the future you want to provide telemedicine advice for anxiety during the next, hopefully not to happen, pandemic or stressful time the world might want to go through. The legislation might have changed. Are you the one providing everything, or are you the one just thinking about that user yoga experience, amazing telemedicine future? That's usually what the company is good at. So mapping out what I'm really good at and what I want to continue to be good at allows you to sort of work backwards and realize which ecosystem of partners you need to be able to master this trait and make sure you survive.
Yeah, absolutely. I think focusing on your business and organizations like TransUnion can help you really navigate these challenges, comply with regulations, and most importantly, end up securing trust with the consumers that you're doing business with. So I think all of those.
Honestly, I would be looking at you, Matt, if I was the consumer, and asking, do you even know what data stewardship is? Do you talk about privacy? Do you understand ethics? Like, those are some of the first questions I'd be asking my technology stack provider, even though they all should have the same degree of greatness technology. Remember my joke before, like, leave the balancing act to the circus. It's not convenience or security, it's both. What else is their added value? So it turns into a partnership.
Yeah, and being good stewards of consumer data is really TransUnion, our foundation. It's really sort of above all everything else. It's really a way of life, not just securing the data, but ensuring it's used with permissible purpose and need, and complying with all industry and regional regulations. And one of the ways we do that, I think, really effectively is we actually have boots on the ground throughout the world. We've got regional offices and folks that are aware of the local compliance and the regulations, and work with businesses, in those different geographies to really help an organization be able to do business, effectively and thrive, wherever they're doing business. And
this
that's
is what I
something
think to people is, like, do they have boots on the ground? Do they want the cost of that, or is that the added value you have to be not only with but ahead, to allow them to see ahead, right?
That's right, and being ahead and having the boots on the ground is key, but also I think being able to have the volume of transactions and data coming through to stay ahead of some of those strategies. So if your organization has a lot of transactions, you might be able to see some things happening, but if maybe you don't, or there's different industries where fraud trends are happening and not yet in yours, they may come to yours, and organizations like TransUnion are going to be able to give you some of those insights and help you pivot and be ready to address that before it becomes a problem. So, it's not just your industry or particular business. It's thinking, I think, even larger than that, and understanding what's coming down the pipe and being prepared to deal with that proactively, and not waiting until it's a problem and then trying to solve it at that point. So as we get ready to come to the end of our session here, is there anything else you want to cover before we wrap up?
No, Matt. I think there's one thing that I'll leave, which is like last week on Financial Times, Microsoft released, if you don't believe me or Matt, Microsoft, which is a pretty reputable company, released something called Open Data Framework. So they're trying to establish and say that data shouldn't belong only on the hands of the large technology players, the U.S. or China or any particular sovereignty. So you're starting to see this as an entire fundly sort of NGO-like project they're building to bring literacy. So if they think this is a marketing tactics during the middle of the world pandemic, what makes you think that you should maybe pay attention and look at this and take this opportunity to tell that story proud, and let's change this industry, because there's lots to do and to talk about. And thank you, Matt.
Thank you. Well, we want to thank everyone for taking part in this webinar. Bianca, this was excellent. If we did not get to your question, we will follow up with you directly.
Which we didn't, so sorry.
Yeah, there was a lot coming through, and we had a good conversation going there, so I tried to work some of the themes in, but I know there are some specific pointed questions, and we will follow up with you after this session, so do be assured of that. I also want to just remind everyone that the recording and the slides will be coming up in the first webinar. Be sure to check that out, The Business Imperative for Identity, Trust, and Data Stewardship. where Bianca did cover some themes around identity proofing and the future of it amidst changing economic dynamics from the pandemic and otherwise. So be sure to have a look at that. That one's out and available now. That recording's available on demand. And again, this recording will be made available. And if you would like more information on TransUnion's approach to identity and fraud prevention, we welcome you to visit transunion.com/IDvision, where you can find some more information, and we'd be happy to have a look at how an organization like ours can help you remove this burden and really have a good strategy for identity and fraud prevention and data stewardship so that your organization can thrive in these changing economic dynamics. So we thank you for your time and have a great day.